Hello, this is the Britjet's PSX Tips, the Aerowinks PSX 747-400 desktop simulation, and today I'm going to be talking about two engines inoperative. A bit of history: the classic 747 had poor performance compared to the 400. Typically they would reduce fuel to minimum reserves to make the aircraft as light as possible, and throughout the approach it would be a progressive slowing down and progressively selecting the last stage of flap, sometimes as low as 400 or 500 feet. The 400 does not have the same problem. The majority of the approach is flown in a very similar manner to a typical one engine out approach, and it therefore is not a major issue. How symmetrical you want to be is up to you. You can fail two engines on the same side, which is the way flight crew are tested, one inboard or one outboard, or you could fail inboards and outboards. I suggest if you're going to practice this that you start off failing a symmetrical pair. Probably the best ones to fail would be the inboards. Now, the one engine inoperative situation does not have a dedicated checklist. Two engines inoperative, however, does. It's unenunciated. You won't get anything on the ICAS, and you will have to find your way through to section 7 of the QRH to find the relevant checklist items. As I've said before in these videos, 747 QRHs vary quite a lot in detail. This particular one has some items on it which are pretty standard Boeing statements, and what I'm going to do now is run through the QRH with some additional comments and suggestions of my own, and then we'll try and fly the approaches for real. Okay, let's have a look at this generic two engines inoperative checklist. Typical one you'll find on the internet. A lot of detail missing, but having said that, this is a very good example of how a Boeing QRH is presented, and there's lots of stuff that you don't really think of until you come to try and fly it. This is why crews train these things in the simulator, of course. So first of all, I'll say it's a Mayday. Then you'll see the checklist has 2 points in it: auto throttle inoperative, and then checklist complete except deferred items. Wonderful. He's told you one thing, and then it says get on with it. And the get on with it bit involves flying the approach and knowing how to fly a very different go around should that be required. So a lot of briefing would be required by multi-crew here to understand how to do it, and if you're doing it on your own, a lot of rehearsal and a lot of thought is needed. But coming back to the checklist, it talks about a landing commit point is gear extension there under deferred items. What they mean by that is don't put the gear down until you're sure you can land. And by that I mean air traffic control have cleared you for landing, the runway's clear, you're happy that you can make the approach, and there's nobody in front of you that's going to land and block the runway. And then there's a warning, and it says don't try and go around after passing the landing commit point. Performance is not assured. No, performance is not assured, but in fact the aircraft does surprisingly well. So the fact you've passed your commit point does not mean you can't fly a go around if something happens at a late stage in the approach. Flaps. Use flaps 25 and VREF 25. Normal flap 25 landing, normal flap 25 landing distance. There is very little difference between this and a normal flap 25 landing in terms of landing distance. They asked you to switch two packs off. This is to protect bleed requirements for the aircraft systems because you've only got two engines providing air. In particular, this is protecting the ADPs, which provide backup hydraulics to the landing gear and flap extension. Now, what this particular checklist doesn't mention is in fact that not only have you lost your auto throttle, as it tells you in point number 1, but you've also lost LNAV and VNAV. You can press the button, but it won't engage. You're back to basic modes such as heading and VS and lock and glide slope. The other thing you can't do is carry out an auto land. Now, having mentioned those two things, I think you'll see that this checklist isn't covering everything, and that's true of a lot of Boeing QRH checklists. What weight would you land at? Well, the old classic days, as I said earlier, you would dump fuel to minimum reserves so that the aircraft was as light as possible. That's not an issue with the 400 now. What you can do is actually land overweight if necessary, because they would rather have you land the aircraft as soon as possible rather than spend time dumping fuel. And then we run into the checklist, descent checklist, and you'll see there in bold landing data VREF 25, which we know, and then minimums. Now your minimums would quite probably be the normal ILS minimums, but don't forget, if you get down to ILS minimums and you can't see the runway, going around on two engines from 200 feet is not going to work. So you would have to raise your minimums to a height that would enable you to fly a go-around if you weren't visual. Your minimums might have to be raised even more to enable you to carry out a successful go-around. So minimums here requires some thought. And then we carry on to fly the approach. Now you'll see there we carry on with a go-around procedure review, which I'll talk about later. And below that it says extend the landing gear and select flaps 20 at glide slope intercept or at final descent point. So typically 3,000 feet or so, 2,500 feet maybe, on the glide slope, put your gear and flaps 20 down, and then you're flying a fairly stable approach. And then approaching 1,000 feet AGL, I would suggest 1,500 feet, selects flap 25. Now you'll see here it also mentions centering the rudder trim. Now for a one engined inoperative approach, you don't center the rudder trim. For a two engines inoperative approach, you do. And that would have to be managed by the other pilot if you're multi-crew, or if you're lucky enough to have a button that does automatic centering, then that's even better. And the rest of the landing checklist follows on. So a two-engined approach on the 400 is actually very similar to a one-engined approach, but you are manual thrust throughout. You have to put the flaps down a little bit later on the approach, and you are going to be using the rudder trim at 0. So that's how you fly the approach on the two engines inoperative. Let's have a look at the profile in a bit more detail. Flap 5 on the intercept heading. The power settings you'll require throughout will be about twice what you would normally need in terms of EPA. So for an RB211, something in the region of about 1.4 or 1.36 would be a good guide. Depends on weight, depends on flap. Bring the aircraft in on the final approach, and as soon as the glide slope becomes alive or approaching the glide slope, select flaps 10, throttle back a little bit to get back to your 10 bug. And then as you approach the glide slope intercept, make sure you have landing clearance and so on. Then you can go gear down flaps 20. That's your commit point. Then you fly down the glide slope, and round about 1,500 feet I recommend flaps 25, zero the rudder trim, and you should be nice and stable by 1,000 feet with about twice your normal thrust setting. Now this particular approach implies that you come down with glide slope green, so if the autopilot was engaged you would now be locked onto glide slope. I recommend you don't do that. Fine to fly it by autopilot, but if you're going to go down a glide slope, then the only way you can do it, if you need to do a decent go around, is to do it in VS. So even if you have an ILS, I recommend you fly the glide slope in vertical speed. That way, if you subsequently have to carry out a go-around, it's fairly easy to manage the auto-flight system. You will remember that if the autopilot is engaged in glide slope, the only way to get out of it without disengaging the autopilot is to press toga. We do not press toga for a two engines inoperative go-around. So localizer's fine, or heading, and VS down the slope. Okay, here's the nightmare scenario. You've done everything right, you've got to your commit point, air traffic control have cleared you to land, the runway's clear, everything's okay, and then an idiot drives across the runway and you have to carry out a go-around. As I said earlier, just because you're below your commit point does not mean you can't carry out a go-around, so let's carry on the procedure. The first thing it says on the QRH there on the left is do not use toga. There are obvious reasons to this. The toga pitch bars will take the aeroplane straight up to a high climb rate, which it's not capable of. Don't use toga. If you're flying it yourself, then go around flaps 20, select the flaps to 20, put the thrust up to maximum, provided you're not flying very slowly. I'll come on to that in a bit. And then bring the gear up and then press Alt Hold. Do it in that order unless terrain is very critical, in which case you might press Alt Hold a bit earlier. And then you're just trying to maintain the height while the aircraft slowly cleans up. Passing the 10 bug, select the flaps to 10. Passing the 5 bug, select the flaps to 5. And when you get to VREF 30 plus 60 knots, which is round about the 1 bug, depending on how you've got them set up, you would then select the flaps to 1 and do a gentle climb in VS. And away you go. Now, while all this is going on, you've got to keep the aircraft in balance. So be very, very wary of how your rudder is being applied, particularly if you're still in localizer mode, because the localizer, of course, will be quite sensitive and you might find the aircraft putting in quite a lot of bank. The way to fix this is to go to heading cell, which will actually make things a little bit more comfortable. Do that above 400 feet. So now you're climbing away at 1, flat 1, at VREF 30 plus 60, and when you get to your AA, whatever it is, to ensure that you're going to be clear of terrain, then as normal, select flight level change, speed to the up bug, and accelerate to the up bug and retract the flaps. Now you'll see that this profile diagram then says autopilot can be re-engaged. The assumption on this particular diagram, which I've nicked, is that you take the autopilot out for the whole maneuver. That's actually not necessary. Provided that you have kept the aircraft in a VS mode, you will be able to fly the whole thing very neatly with the autopilot engaged. Now I said I'd mention speed control and how much thrust you put on. In the little red box at top right, you'll see that it says if insufficient rudder control is due to VMs being less than VMCA2. Now VMCA2, minimum control speed in the air 2 with 2 engines in operative, is around about 160 knots. If you were to go around at a very low speed, then they recommend to advance the thrust levers as they give there. Basically, you push the levers forward with a bit of a stagger. And I'll leave you to read that. It shouldn't be a major issue. As you go up to your go-around altitude, of course, you will then become clean, which is what you're aiming for, but don't forget that you're still in manual thrust, so you will have to throttle the engines back to maintain the speed as you level off. So that's the 2 engines in operative go-around, and as you can see, it's very, very different to a normal go-around, and it's well worth practicing. So I'll leave you to read the contents and inwardly digest. So here you are on short finals, nice and relaxed. Keep the aircraft in balance throughout. Remember, you are not going to gobble up runway. Don't get low and slow. This is the danger. If you suddenly find yourself a bit low on the approach and you have to put on a lot of power, that completely destabilizes things. So you have to really keep on top of your balance and keep on top of the glide path. As you approach the flare, just relax the rudder to 0 as you close the thrust levers and the aircraft should go straight. With regard to reverse, the landing distance does not require reverse as long as the runway is dry. So you should be able to use reverse idle, which gets the leading edges in, which is a good idea. And don't use any more than reverse, unless of course you are symmetrical, in which case reverse is perfectly okay. Once you come to a halt, you should be able to taxi off even with 2 engines out on one side, but just beware you don't use too much thrust in the real world, because your EPA for an RB211 will be 1.08 EPA maximum. So that's the details. Let's go on to look at the actual approach.